Wife created a equality contract to control me. I used it to destroy her career. I came home to find my wife had legally notarized a 47-page relationship equality contract that she expected me to sign immediately, or face consequences for noncompliance. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording her planning this for weeks, and her own contract was about to become her worst nightmare. Let me start with the moment everything changed. 3 months ago, I walked into our kitchen and found my wife Sarah sitting at the table with what looked like a law school textbook, furiously highlighting sections about domestic power structures and contractual obligations in intimate relationships. "Interesting reading?" I asked, pouring myself coffee. She looked up with this expression I'd never seen before. Part lawyer, part cult leader, all trouble. "I'm researching equitable relationship frameworks," she said, like that was a totally normal Tuesday morning activity. "Did you know that most marriages operate under unconscious patriarchal contracts that systematically disadvantage women?" Red flag number 1. If you're into honest stories about relationships, trust, and betrayal, hit that follow button. You won't want to miss the next one. "I wasn't aware our marriage had any contract," I replied, sitting down across from her. "Exactly the problem. Informal power structures allow for exploitation and inequality. We need formal agreements to ensure balanced partnership dynamics." She'd been talking like this for weeks, using academic jargon to describe our normal married life, like it was some kind of oppressive regime. But this was the first time I'd seen actual research materials. "What kind of formal agreements?" Her eyes lit up like I'd just asked her to explain her doctoral thesis. "Comprehensive behavioral contracts that establish clear expectations, accountability measures, and enforcement mechanisms for equitable relationship maintenance." Enforcement mechanisms. For our marriage, that afternoon I decided to do some research of my own. Not about relationship contracts, but about my wife's recent behavior changes. See, Sarah worked as an adjunct professor in women's studies at the local college, and over the past few months, she'd been coming home with increasingly radical ideas about systematic oppression in our household. Ideas that always seemed to target things I did. I installed a voice recorder app on an old phone and started leaving it running in our living room when Sarah had her weekly calls with her graduate school friends. What I discovered was way worse than I'd imagined. "The psychological conditioning runs so deep," Sarah was explaining to someone during one of these calls. "He doesn't even realize he's exhibiting classic dominant behavior patterns." "Have you tried direct confrontation?" a woman's voice asked. "Direct confrontation just triggers defensive responses. I'm implementing a more systematic approach." "Like what?" "Legal documentation. If I can get him to sign a comprehensive behavioral contract, I'll have formal grounds for addressing noncompliance." Legal documentation. She was literally building a case against me in our own marriage. "What happens if he refuses to sign?" "Then I'll have documented evidence of his unwillingness to participate in equitable relationship structures." Either way, I establish a framework for next steps. Next steps, that phrase made my blood run cold. The conversations continued for weeks, and each one revealed more of Sarah's plan. She wasn't just creating rules for our marriage. She was creating legal ammunition for destroying it if I didn't comply with her demands. But here's what Sarah didn't know about me. I work in contract law. Specifically, I help companies identify and exploit loopholes in partnership agreements. And if my wife wanted to play lawyer with our marriage, she just challenged the wrong guy. The day she presented me with the contract, I was ready. I walked into our living room after work to find Sarah sitting behind our dining table, which she'd apparently transformed into a conference room setup. The contract was laid out like a legal document, complete with numbered tabs, highlighted sections, and sticky notes marking signature lines. "Welcome to our relationship restructuring meeting," she announced, gesturing to the chair across from her like I was about to be deposed. I sat down and started reading. 47 pages of the most insane demands I'd ever seen disguised as equality measures. Page 1. Domestic labor distribution requirements. I would be responsible for 67 of household tasks because I made more money, with task completion tracked on a digital spreadsheet she would monitor daily. Page 12. Communication protocol enforcement. All disagreements had to follow a specific script, with violations documented and reviewed in monthly relationship performance meetings. Page 23, Financial Transparency and Accountability Measures. Every purchase over 50 required written justification and approval from both parties, with purchases over 200 requiring a formal presentation explaining the necessity and long-term impact. Page 31, Social Interaction Oversight Guidelines. Time spent with friends, family, or colleagues required advance notification and post-interaction debriefing to ensure activities aligned with relationship development goals. Page 40, Personal Development Compliance Requirements. I would attend mandatory workshops on masculine toxicity, privilege awareness, and emotional intelligence enhancement, with completion certificates filed in our Relationship Improvement portfolio. But the real kicker was on page 45, Non-Compliance Consequences and Escalation Procedures. If I violated any aspect of the contract, Sarah would document the incident, assign point values based on severity, and implement corrective measures ranging from additional household duties to mandatory individual therapy with providers of her choosing. And if I accumulated more than 100 violation points in a 6-month period, the contract automatically triggered a relationship dissolution protocol that would basically hand her everything in a divorce. This is incredible, I said, flipping through the pages. Sarah smiled, clearly interpreting my amazement as admiration. I've been working on it for months. Every section addresses documented patterns of inequality in our relationship dynamic. How long did this take you? About 200 hours of research and drafting. I wanted to make sure it was comprehensive and legally sound. Legally sound. That's when I knew she was planning to use this thing in court if I didn't sign it. And you expect me to sign this tonight? I've scheduled a notary for 8 p.m. Once it's executed, we can begin implementing the new framework immediately. A notary. She'd already arranged for legal witnesses to my signing. This wasn't a conversation. It was a contract signing ceremony. Before I sign, I said, I'd like to request a few additions. Her confidence flickered for just a moment. What kind of additions? Well, if we're establishing formal accountability measures, shouldn't they apply equally to both parties? The contract already addresses mutual obligations. Actually, it doesn't. I pulled out my own notebook, the one I'd been using to document her behavior for the past month. For instance, Section 7 requires me to provide 24-hour advance notice for social activities, but there's no corresponding requirement for you. That's because my social activities support my professional development. According to who? Because I don't see any criteria for distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable social activities. Sarah was starting to look uncomfortable. The framework is designed to address existing power imbalances. Right, but who determines what constitutes a power imbalance? Because Section 12 gives you unilateral authority to evaluate my communication violations, but there's no mechanism for me to evaluate yours. I flipped through my notebook. For example, last Tuesday, you interrupted me 14 times during a conversation about vacation planning, but the contract doesn't classify interruption as a communication violation when you do it. That's different. How is it different? Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since this whole thing started, she didn't have a pre-written answer. Here's what I'm thinking, I continued. If we're going to do this, let's do it right. I've prepared some amendments that address the logical inconsistencies in your framework. I pulled out my own folder, 62 pages of amendments, corrections, and additions that turned her control document into an actual equality contract. Her face went pale as she realized what I was holding. What is this? Your contract improved. For instance, Amendment 23 establishes a peer review process for violation assessments, so neither of us can unilaterally assign penalty points to the other. I flipped to another section. Amendment 31 creates reciprocal oversight requirements, so if I need approval for purchases over 200, you do too. This wasn't the point of the exercise. What was the point? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you created a legal document that gives you authority over every aspect of my life while exempting yourself from the same standards. Sarah was frantically flipping through my amendments. And I could see her realizing that her carefully crafted control mechanism had been turned into an actual partnership agreement. Amendment 47 is my personal favorite, I said. It establishes professional conduct standards for both parties, including prohibitions against using our personal relationship as research material for academic publications without explicit consent. She stopped reading and looked up at me with genuine fear in her eyes. You know about my research? I know you've been documenting our private conversations for your dissertation on resistance patterns in domestic power structure reformation. I know you've been sharing intimate details about our marriage with your study group, and I know you're planning to publish case studies about systematic relationship intervention methodologies using our marriage as your primary data source. The folder in her hands was shaking now. How do you? I've been doing my own research. Turns out when you're married to someone who records private conversations for academic analysis, it's pretty easy to get access to that research data. I pulled out a second folder. This contains transcripts of every conversation you've had about our marriage over the past 3 months, including the ones where you discussed using this contract as evidence in divorce proceedings if I didn't comply with your behavioral modification protocols. Sarah's face had gone from pale to gray. But here's the really interesting part, I continued. Your research methodology violates about 12 different ethical standards for academic studies involving human subjects. You can't use data gathered without informed consent, especially from intimate relationships, and you definitely can't publish case studies about people who haven't agreed to participate in your research. I wasn't going to use real names. Doesn't matter. Your university's ethics board is going to have some serious questions about a professor who experiments on her own husband without his knowledge or consent. Sarah sat down heavily, still staring at my amendments to her contract. You've been planning this, she said. I've been protecting myself because unlike you, I didn't sign up to be a lab rat in someone's academic research project disguised as marriage counseling. The notary arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, a cheerful woman in her 60s who clearly thought she was witnessing a romantic couple's contract signing ceremony. How wonderful that you're formalizing your commitment to each other, she said, setting up her stamps and seal. I don't see many relationship contracts, but the young couples today are so much more thoughtful about these things. Sarah looked like she was about to be sick. Actually, I said, we've had some last-minute revisions to review before signing. I handed the notary my amended version of the contract, 109 pages that transformed Sarah's control document into a genuinely equitable partnership agreement with real consequences for both parties. My goodness, the notary said, flipping through the pages. This is quite comprehensive. We believe in thoroughness, I replied, looking directly at Sarah, especially when establishing frameworks for accountability and oversight. Sarah tried one last desperate move. Maybe we should postpone the signing until we've had more time to review the amendments. No need, I said. I've been reviewing your original contract for weeks, just like you've been reviewing our marriage for your research. I think we're both ready to make this official. The notary looked between us, clearly sensing tension, but not understanding the dynamics at play. Are you both prepared to sign this document willingly and without coercion? Absolutely, I said. Sarah hesitated, realizing that refusing to sign would essentially admit that her entire equality framework was actually about control rather than partnership. I need to read through the amendments first. Of course, the notary said. Take all the time you need. For the next 2 hours, Sarah read through every page of my amendments while I sat there drinking coffee and watching her realize that her own contract language was being used to create actual accountability measures that applied to both of us. Amendment 15 required both parties to disclose any use of the relationship as research material or case study data. Amendment 22 established equal authority over financial decisions, with both parties subject to the same approval processes. Amendment 33 created reciprocal oversight of social activities, with both parties required to provide advance notice and post-activity debriefings. Amendment 48 prohibited either party from unilaterally changing household rules or implementing new behavioral requirements without mutual consent. And my personal masterpiece, Amendment 61. Any violation of the contract by either party would result in immediate dissolution of the agreement and restoration of traditional relationship dynamics. This isn't what I intended, Sarah said finally. What did you intend? Because this contract implements everything you said you wanted. Formal equality measures, documented accountability, and legal enforcement of partnership standards. But the amendment about research disclosure? You mean the amendment that requires you to get permission before using our marriage as academic research material? What's the problem with that? Sarah couldn't answer because the problem was obvious. Her entire research project depended on secret documentation of our relationship dynamics, and my amendment made that impossible. I think we should discuss this privately before making it legally binding, she said. No need for private discussion. Everything's been documented according to your research protocols. Unless you're suggesting that formal documentation isn't actually the best approach to relationship management? The notary was checking her watch. I do need to wrap this up soon. Of course, I said, picking up the pen. Sarah, are you ready to sign our equality contract? She stared at the document for a long moment, realizing that signing would destroy her research project, while refusing to sign would expose her entire equality campaign as a manipulation tactic. I need more time to consider this. How much time? Because you seemed pretty confident that 200 hours of research and drafting was sufficient preparation for implementing formal relationship contracts. Sarah looked trapped, which was exactly the point. She'd created a legal framework for controlling me, and I'd turned it into a legal framework for actual equality, something she apparently wasn't prepared for. Maybe we don't need a formal contract after all, she said quietly. Really, after months of explaining why informal relationship structures enable oppression and inequality? After insisting that only legal documentation could ensure fair partnership dynamics? The notary was packing up her materials. It sounds like you folks need more time to work through this. Actually, I said, I think we're done here. After the notary left, Sarah and I sat in our living room surrounded by contract pages and legal amendments, and I could see her finally understanding what had just happened. You manipulated me, she said. I applied your own methodology to your own framework. If that feels like manipulation, maybe you should examine what that tells you about your original approach. This isn't how relationships are supposed to work. You're right, relationships aren't supposed to work through legal contracts and behavioral modification protocols. They're supposed to work through mutual respect and honest communication. Things that disappeared from our marriage the moment you decided I was a research subject instead of a partner. Sarah started crying, but not the angry tears I'd expected. These looked like genuine realization tears. I thought I was making us more equal. You thought you were making me more compliant. There's a difference. What happens now? I gathered up all the contract pages and amendments. Now you decide whether you want a husband or a research subject, because I'm done being both. She chose research subject. 2 weeks later, I came home to find Sarah packing her office supplies into boxes. She'd taken a position at another university across the country, she explained, where she could focus on her academic career without the complications of mixing personal relationships with professional research. I got the fellowship I applied for, she said, not quite meeting my eyes. The one for studying domestic power dynamics in controlled environments. Congratulations. I'm sure you'll find plenty of willing subjects for your research. I want you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. You meant for them to go exactly this far. You just expected me to cooperate with the process instead of understanding it. She finished packing and stood in our doorway with her boxes. I did love you, you know. You loved the idea of reforming me. That's not the same thing. Maybe not, she admitted. Maybe I got so focused on fixing what I thought was wrong that I forgot about what was right. Maybe you never thought anything was right to begin with. Sarah left that afternoon, and with her went all the spreadsheets, behavioral contracts, and research protocols that had turned our marriage into a sociology experiment. 6 months later, I got a call from her department head at the new university. Apparently, Sarah had been terminated for ethical violations after attempting to conduct undisclosed relationship research on her graduate students and their partners. She listed you as a reference for her research methodology experience, the department head explained. I was hoping you could provide some insight into her previous work. Wami, her methodology involves treating intimate relationships as laboratory environments without informed consent from the subjects, I told him. You made the right decision terminating her. Did she conduct similar research during your marriage? Extensively, without my knowledge or permission. I'd be happy to provide documentation if you need it for your ethics investigation. I never heard from Sarah again after that conversation, but I did hear from her former colleagues that her academic career was effectively over after word spread about her research methods. Last month, I ran into one of her graduate school friends at a coffee shop. She recognized me and came over to apologize. We had no idea how far she was taking the relationship analysis, she said. We thought she was just venting about normal marriage stuff, not collecting data for academic research. Did you know about the contract? We knew she was working on some kind of formal agreement, but she made it sound like couples therapy homework, not legal documentation for behavioral control. What did you think when she told you about recording our conversations? The woman looked genuinely shocked. She was recording your conversations? For months, everything we discussed was research material for her dissertation. That's completely unethical. We would never have encouraged that if we'd known. It turned out that Sarah had been lying to everyone, her friends, her colleagues, even her dissertation advisor. She'd presented her research as hypothetical case studies rather than actual documentation of real relationship manipulation. Her advisor withdrew support for the project when he found out she'd been experimenting on her own husband, the woman told me. The University Ethics Board launched a full investigation. So Sarah's grand experiment in relationship equality ended with her losing her career, her marriage, and her academic reputation. All because she couldn't tell the difference between partnership and control. As for me, I'm doing fine. I live in a house where I can make coffee without consulting a spreadsheet, watch TV without requesting permission, and have conversations without wondering if they're being recorded for research purposes. I learned that equality isn't something you impose on people through contracts and documentation. It's something you create together through respect and honest communication. Things that Sarah never really understood. And I learned that when someone tries to turn your marriage into a sociology experiment, the best response isn't anger or resistance. It's showing them exactly what their methodology looks like when applied consistently and honestly. Sarah wanted to study domestic power dynamics. Instead, she became a case study in how academic arrogance can destroy everything you claim to value. The patriarchy-free zone she created ended up being population 0. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.